May 13, 1945, Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea. 24 Americans boarded a C-47 transport aircraft on what was supposed to be a short sightseeing trip over the lush, mountainous heart of New Guinea. For the men and women of the Far East Air Service Command, it was a well-earned break, a routine flight to view the fabled Shangri-La Valley, a place so untouched by time that until recently, its native inhabitants had never even seen a white person. 3 hours up and back. Easy. Safe. Just a detour from war. The Japanese were retreating, their empire crumbling across the Pacific. Berlin had fallen days earlier. Peace felt imminent. No one expected the flight to become one of the most harrowing survival stories of the Second World War. The aircraft, a twin-engine Douglas C-47, nicknamed Gremlin Special, took off from Hollandia around noon under clear skies. The passengers, 9 officers, 9 WACs, Women's Army Corps, and 6 enlisted men, were thrilled for the change of pace. For months, many had been confined to monotonous base duties, sorting mail, fixing planes, handling logistics. Now they were flying toward a legend, an Eden hidden among 14,000-foot ridgelines, where tribal warriors still roamed with spears and stone axes. It was a trip meant to lift spirits. Instead, it would become a fight for survival. The pilot, Captain Herbert Dyke Good, was experienced with over 4,000 flying hours. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Eleanor Harland, was equally seasoned. The plan was straightforward. Cruise over the towering ridges, descend for a low pass across the valley floor, let the passengers snap some photos of the Stone Age villages below, then return to base by dusk. Among the passengers was Corporal Margaret Hastings, a 24-year-old postal clerk with the WACs. Blonde, curious, and adventurous, she had been stationed in New Guinea for months, spending her days knee-deep in military correspondence. This was her first chance to see the jungle beyond the wire. Sitting near the cockpit was Lieutenant John McCullum, a 30-year-old navigator. His identical twin brother, Robert, also aboard, had convinced him to come along. It was a rare opportunity for them to relax together. Near the rear sat Sergeant Kenneth Decker, a quiet radio operator who had earned a reputation for calm under pressure. He too had looked forward to the brief escape. They weren't combat troops. They weren't supposed to be anywhere near danger. But war has a way of ignoring who's supposed to be safe. At roughly 3:15 p.m., as the Gremlin Special banked for a second pass across the valley, descending for a closer look, something went wrong. Tragically wrong. Without warning, the aircraft slammed into the side of a ridge cloaked in jungle mist. One moment, the passengers were peering out at a breathtaking landscape. The next, the aircraft collided headlong with the mountain, traveling at full speed. The impact was instant and catastrophic. The nose crumpled, the fuselage sheared open. Aviation fuel burst into flame, turning the aircraft into a fireball. 21 people died instantly. Some were crushed by twisted metal. Others burned alive in the wreckage. A few were thrown from the plane, their bodies later discovered scattered among the trees. The serene, untouched valley they had come to admire had become a graveyard. But 3 passengers crawled out of the wreckage. Margaret Hastings emerged with both legs badly burned. Her clothes were charred, her skin blistered and torn. Lieutenant John McCullum survived, shaken and bloodied, his twin brother dead in the crash. Sergeant Kenneth Decker had a broken arm, his face scorched from the fire, one eye swelling shut. They were alone. No food, no medical supplies, no way to signal for help, and no one even knew they were still alive. The crash site lay buried deep within Shangri-La Valley, surrounded by razor-edge ridgelines and 14,000-foot peaks. Dense jungle cloaked the terrain. The nearest Allied airbase, 150 miles away, was unreachable by foot. To make matters worse, Japanese patrols were still known to roam the highlands. And worse still, the valley was home to the Dani, a remote Papuan tribe with a fierce reputation. The Dani had never been fully contacted by the outside world. Explorers who entered their territory often didn't return. They lived by ancient customs, wielded obsidian-tipped spears, wore grass skirts and bone jewelry, and had seen white people only once, When explorer Richard Archbold discovered the valley in 1938, his flight over the region had startled the tribes into hiding. No one had dared set foot there since. Now, 3 wounded Americans were lying in the middle of it, vulnerable, exposed, and utterly isolated. Back at Hollandia, when the Gremlin Special failed to return by nightfall, search planes were dispatched. Days passed. Nothing was found. The jungle canopy was too thick. The mountains too high. The area too vast. Wreckage, if it existed, was invisible from above. But on day 4, one pilot caught a glimpse, a shimmer of aluminum in the undergrowth. The crash site was located, and to everyone's astonishment, signal panels laid out in the clearing spelled, "Help." The military knew survivors were alive. But how to reach them? There were no roads, no landing strips, no trails out. Helicopters were still experimental. Parachute drops were dangerous, and sending in troops overland would take weeks. Assuming they survived the terrain and any hostile encounters with the Danny or Japanese patrols, the army faced a dilemma. Rescue seemed impossible until someone proposed a bold, nearly suicidal plan. Glider extraction. The idea: parachute medics into the valley, keep the survivors alive, clear a jungle meadow into a makeshift runway, then fly in an unpowered glider, a fragile aircraft made of plywood and fabric, and have it snatched by a speeding C-47 hauling it back into the air with a hook and cable system. It had been done in training, but never with passengers, never in the jungle, and never behind enemy lines. It was a plan with no margin for error. 100 things could go wrong. The glider pilots would write goodbye letters to their families before attempting it. But the survivors didn't know any of that yet. They were huddled in the jungle, wounded, terrified, waiting for rescue or death. This was the beginning of Operation Shangri-La. The air was calm, the sky was clear, but hidden currents swirled through the jagged mountain ridges like invisible rivers. As the Gremlin Special dipped low for another viewing pass, the aircraft suddenly shuddered. A violent downdraft, common in the New Guinea highlands, deadly to low-flying planes, slammed the C-47 downward. Captain Good reacted instantly, shoving the throttles forward. The engines roared. The plane did not climb. Instead, the nose continued to drop. Passengers felt the floor tilt beneath them. Loose equipment slid. Someone shouted that they were falling. Someone else began to pray. McCullum, sitting near the front, saw treetops rising toward the windows. Far too fast. Good hauled back on the yoke with all his strength. The mountainside filled the windshield. There was no altitude left to gain. No turning radius. No chance. At 3:15 p.m., the Gremlin Special struck the first line of trees. The left wing clipped a massive trunk, shearing off instantly. The impact spun the aircraft sideways, slamming the fuselage into the mountainside with catastrophic force. The aircraft tore apart. Aluminum skin peeled away like paper. Seats ripped loose. Bodies were flung forward. Fuel tanks ruptured and atomized gasoline ignited in a single thunderous fireball. Corporal Margaret Hastings remembered nothing except the sensation of being hurled forward, the shriek of twisting metal, and an eruption of fire engulfing everything. Her legs felt like they were on fire because she couldn't breathe, couldn't see. Someone, she never learned who, grabbed her by her uniform and dragged her through a jagged tear in the fuselage. She slid, fell, tumbled down a slope until a tree stopped her descent. Behind her, the Gremlin Special became an inferno. Flames roared 50 feet high. Ammunition inside the wreck began exploding, popping like rapid-fire gunshots. Screams echoed through the valley for a handful of seconds, then vanished. Lieutenant John McCullum had been thrown free during the initial impact. Dazed, bleeding, he staggered to his feet and stared in horror at the burning aircraft. The fire was so intense he had to shield his face with his arms. Bodies could be seen inside the wreck, unmoving, engulfed in flame. He shouted names, especially Robert, his twin brother. No answer. He tried to move closer, but the heat forced him back. A cry from the jungle pulled him away from the wreck. He found Hastings lying against a tree, her legs blistered and charred. She was shaking uncontrollably, in shock but alive. He carried her farther from the flames as explosions continued behind them. Minutes later, Sergeant Kenneth Decker emerged from the brush, stumbling, half-blind with burns. His right arm bent at a sickening angle. But he was walking. He could speak. And he was the last one. 21 dead. 3 survivors. They sat together as the aircraft burned into the night. They had no food, no shelter, no idea where they were. No idea whether the Dani tribesmen or Japanese soldiers might find them first. Margaret's burns were severe. Her legs were raw, blackened in places and swelling rapidly. Infection in the jungle environment begins within hours. She tried not to cry out. Noise might draw danger in a land where everything unfamiliar could kill them. McCullum searched the debris field and miraculously found a small first aid kit thrown clear of the crash. Morphine, bandages, sulfa powder. Barely enough for one wound, let alone dozens. But it was all they had. He injected Margaret with morphine to dull the agony. Night fell fast in the highlands. The jungle became absolute darkness. Noise surrounded them. The buzz of insects, distant animal calls, rustling leaves. None of them slept. They huddled together in silence, terrified firelight might reveal them, terrified of the unknown shapes moving in the undergrowth, terrified of the possibility the Japanese might still be in the mountains. May 14th. Morning revealed how desperate their situation was. They were on a steep slope blanketed by dense foliage. Margaret Hastings could not stand. Her legs gave out at the slightest pressure. Her burns were beginning to ooze, an unmistakable sign of infection. McCullum and Decker used parachute silk and branches to fashion a stretcher. It was crude, uncomfortable, and almost impossible to maneuver through the jungle, especially with Decker's broken arm. They worked anyway. They had to move. They needed water, flat ground, a signal point. Hours later, exhausted, sweating, bloodied by vines and thorns, they found a small stream. They drank greedily, refilled canteens, washed wounds as best they could. Then they dragged the stretcher farther downslope until they found a slight opening in the canopy where sunlight reached the ground. Not a clearing, but close enough. Anything that could be seen from the sky was a lifeline. Using more parachute fabric, they spelled out a crude signal panel and waited. All day they listened for planes. None came. May 15th. Margaret's fever rose. Her burns were red, swollen, streaked with infection lines. A life-threatening danger in jungle conditions. They rationed the morphine. They cleaned the wounds as best as 2 uninjured hands could manage. McCullum climbed a ridge for a better view. Every direction was the same. Jungle, cliffs, distant mountains, and the vast, lonely valley. There was no way out on foot, no trail, no hope of reaching Allied lines with a stretcher. They had to be found. That night, Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness. Decker took the first watch. McCullum the second. Both men were terrified to sleep. May 16th, the 4th day. At last, the sound of engines. A C-47 appeared over the valley, low enough that its wingtips nearly skimmed treetops. McCullum waved parachute silk wildly. Hastings could barely lift her head. Decker stood on a log, signaling with the silver lining of a ration can. The plane banked sharply. It had seen them. It dropped a supply canister with food, water purification tablets, sulfa powder, blankets, and a handwritten note. "We see you. Help is coming. Stay put." For the first time since the crash, they cried relief, exhaustion, hope. But the question remained. How could anyone reach them in this valley of jagged mountains, deadly downdrafts, and impenetrable jungle? Back at Hollandia, the army struggled with the same impossible question, and soon began planning an extraction so dangerous that no one had ever attempted it before in wartime. A glider rescue, in hostile territory, with wounded survivors, in a valley no aircraft had ever landed in or taken off from. The most daring rescue plan of the Pacific War was about to begin. In the chaos of jungle warfare, there were rules, and then there was Shangri-La. Colonel Ray Ellsmer sat in his command tent at Hollandia, poring over maps, terrain recon photos, and altitude charts. Nothing made sense. The survivors were alive. That much was now certain. A C-47 had spotted them, dropped supplies, even confirmed their location. But confirming was one thing. Getting them out was another. Standard procedures were useless. No landing zones, no roads, no airstrips, and no way to hike out through 150 miles of brutal mountains and jungle with a severely wounded woman on a stretcher. Ellesmer needed something more than a plan. He needed a miracle. He summoned Major William McKee, an engineer officer with a reputation for solving impossible problems. McKee studied the terrain maps, made some notes, and then said something that made the entire room fall silent. "We'll send in medics by parachute and get them all out by glider snatch." First, no one said a word. Then someone laughed, nervously. The suggestion was unthinkable. Glider snatches were experimental. A year earlier, the U.S. Army had begun testing the idea using cargo dummies. The system was crude, dangerous, and unreliable. Here's how it worked. A nylon tow line was stretched between two poles. A glider on the ground would attach the line to a harness. A C-47 would fly low, hook the line, and yank the glider and its passengers into the air in a matter of seconds. On paper, it worked. In flat terrain, under controlled conditions, with no people aboard. But this wasn't a test range in Kansas. This was a valley ringed by 14,000-foot mountains, surrounded by jungle, with unpredictable winds and Japanese forces still roaming the region. And now someone wanted to try it with live passengers? Colonel Ellesmer weighed the options. There were none. No road, no trail, no helicopters, no planes that could land. It was suicide, but it was the only way. Ellesmer signed the order. Operation Shangri-La was born. Phase 1, get medics on the ground. Phase 2, build a makeshift runway. Phase 3, extract the survivors and the medics, using the first-ever live combat glider snatch in military history. Lieutenant Walter H. Hank Herndon stepped forward to lead the mission. A paratrooper medic from the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, he was 24 years old, from Georgia, and already a veteran of jungle warfare. He had jumped behind enemy lines before, but nothing like this. Joining him was Sergeant Benjamin Bulatao, a Filipino-American combat medic with experience in both medical care and survival in tropical environments. Calm, smart, and reliable under pressure. They had one mission: keep the survivors alive until the glider could get them out. The two men assembled their supplies: morphine, sulfa powder, penicillin, surgical kits, water purification tablets, concentrated rations, machetes, field radios, signal panels, over 200 pounds of gear, all of which had to be airdropped. On May 19, 1945, 6 days after the crash, Herndon and Bulatao boarded a C-47. The aircraft had been stripped of everything non-essential. Their target, a jungle clearing roughly 2 miles from the survivors' last known location. It wasn't ideal. It was the only option. At 9,000 feet, they circled Shangri-La Valley, now fully aware of how deceptive the name was. Paradise didn't look like a wall of mountains wrapped in mist and cloud. It looked like a green prison. Herndon stood in the open doorway of the C-47, eyes scanning the landscape. The drop zone below was no field, just a break in the tree canopy. The wind whipped his jumpsuit. He checked his gear one last time. The green light blinked. He jumped. The canopy deployed. He plummeted fast. Too fast. The air at high altitude was thin, the jungle below thick and unyielding. He hit the trees hard, branches tearing at his uniform, the harness strangling his ribs. His chute caught, yanking him violently upward. Now he was hanging 20 feet above the forest floor, cut and bruised, hanging like a marionette. He triggered the quick-release buckle, fell, hit the jungle floor with a sickening crunch. His right ankle throbbed, possibly sprained, but it could bear weight. He stood, gasping, just as Bulatao dropped through the trees nearby, landing hard but upright. They began gathering the scattered drop containers. One was hanging in a tree. One had smashed open on impact. Some supplies were gone, but most had survived. They didn't wait. They hacked their way toward the survivors, checking compass bearings every few minutes. The jungle swallowed them whole. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. Every movement was a struggle. Hours passed. Then voices. Not English. The medics froze. Footsteps approached. 6 figures emerged from the green wall. Dani tribesmen. Bare-chested, barefoot, armed with stone axes and spears. Their faces painted with white ochre and charcoal, staring with wide, wary eyes. These were men who had never seen a radio, never seen metal tools, and now they were staring at 2 men who had just fallen from the sky. Herndon raised his hands, moved slowly, kept his stance relaxed. He nodded, smiled. One of the Dani stepped forward. No English, just a gesture. A hand sweeping forward into the jungle. He was offering to guide them. Without hesitation, the medics followed. The Dani moved effortlessly through the brush, through terrain the medics could barely crawl through. What had taken hours alone took minutes now. 2 hours later, they arrived. The Dani had been visiting the crash survivors for days. Curious, maybe even reverent. They had brought sweet potatoes, fruit, and water. Unsure what to make of the white-skinned people who had tumbled from a burning sky. Margaret Hastings burst into tears when she saw the uniforms. Real medics. Help. After 7 days. Herndon knelt beside her and examined the burns. They were bad. Worse than he feared. Red, swollen, streaked with infection. A day or 2 more and sepsis would have killed her. He injected penicillin, the experimental wonder drug that had only recently arrived in the Pacific. He gave her a clean dressing, new morphine, proper hydration. Then he turned to McCullum and Decker. Decker's broken arm was badly set. Herndon splinted it properly, wrapped his face burns. McCullum's lacerations were cleaned, infection scrubbed out. The medics stayed silent for a moment. Then Herndon said what they had all hoped to hear. Rescue is coming. But he added, it won't be easy. He described the plan. A glider, no landing gear, no runway, a rope snatch extraction under fire in the middle of the jungle. The survivors stared at him. It sounded like madness. It was, but it was also their only chance. Time was the enemy now. Not the jungle, not the terrain, not even the Japanese patrols believed to be lurking in the higher ridges. Time measured in Margaret Hastings' fever, in the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, in the fatigue etched into every sunburned face. The plan was simple in words, impossible in practice. Build a landing zone, 500 feet long, 30 feet wide, in the middle of a jungle with hand tools. Then, if that miracle was somehow completed, a glider would come. A glider, no engine, no second chance. Just a wooden-framed, fabric-skinned aircraft built to be towed and abandoned. To the survivors, it made no sense. How does a plane with no engine take off in the jungle? Margaret asked. Lieutenant H. Herndon sat beside her, wiping sweat from his neck. It doesn't. Not by itself. A C-47 will hook it by line, yank it into the air like a slingshot. Decker blinked. That's the rescue? Herndon nodded. It's never been done. Not with passengers. Not in mountains. Not behind enemy lines. McCullum asked the only question that mattered. Will it work? Herndon stared at the treetops. I don't know, but it's the only way out. They processed the truth in silence. No backup. No plan B. Either the glider snatch worked or they died in Shangri-La. Meanwhile, the Dani watched and listened. These mountain tribespeople, who had never seen metal before the crash, had become allies. They brought food daily. Roasted sweet potatoes, jungle fruits, small animals caught in snares. They helped carry supplies, guided soldiers through dense thickets. What they lacked in language, they made up for in action. The tools the Americans used fascinated them. Steel machetes, surgical scissors, even zippers on flight jackets were wonders. Parachute silk became gifts. Every scrap of material was valuable. But the Dani didn't just watch. They worked. Without their help, the rescue would have been impossible. On May 20th, Herndon and the other medics scouted the valley floor. In places, the ground was reasonably flat. But nature had no sympathy for desperate men. Kunai grass 8 feet high tangled everything. thick roots, hidden rocks, trees growing in tight clusters. To carve out even 500 feet of flat, clear space meant clearing forest by hand. He radioed Hollandia. "We need help. More men. More tools. Explosives if you have them." Colonel Ellesmer listened, then gave the green light. Axes, shovels, machetes, even TNT charges for stumps, were loaded into supply canisters and dropped by air. Then, something bolder. 15 more men were parachuted into Shangri-La Valley. Soldiers, combat engineers, paratroopers. Every one of them volunteered. Every one of them knew the risks. The jump zone was narrow. Trees everywhere. The landings were violent. Men landed in trees. Some hit the ground hard, suffering sprains, cracked ribs, broken fingers. But every single one survived the descent. By May 26th, Herndon had 17 men on the ground. And finally, the project began in earnest. It was grueling. The kunai grass fought every step, its roots like cables anchoring the soil. Trees were cut down one by one. Stumps dug out with trenching tools. Rocks pried loose with crowbars and rolled away. There were no machines, just muscle, sweat, and a will to survive. Daytime temperatures hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Shirts came off. Skin blistered. Insects swarmed. Rations ran low. They purified stream water with tablets. 8 canned sea rations and whatever the Danny brought. Sometimes monkey. Sometimes roasted beetles. Sometimes jungle greens no American could name. And still, every day the airstrip grew. The Danny joined the work without being asked. They seemed fascinated by the idea of cutting a long path through the jungle just to make a flying machine move. Some even carved tiny gliders from wood, mimicking what they saw the soldiers doing. Meanwhile, Margaret Hastings slowly improved. The penicillin was working. Her fever dropped. The burns on her legs began healing, pink, raw tissue replacing the blackened edges. She could sit up now, talk, eat small meals. But walking, impossible. The damage to her legs was too severe. When the time came, she would have to be carried to the glider. She watched the progress anxiously. Watched men labor for days to gain 5 feet. Heard thunder in the distance. Wondered if the monsoons would come before the rescue did. McCullum and Decker helped where they could, clearing small debris, organizing supplies. McCullum had become the de facto lieutenant of the survivor group, keeping morale up, joking with the troops, keeping Margaret talking when pain threatened to drown her. Psychological pressure built daily. They had been in the valley for weeks now. The extraction plan still sounded like madness. No one had ever attempted a glider snatch like this, not even in training. What if the glider crashed? What if the line snapped? What if it rained the day of the flight? June 5th, 3 weeks since the crash. The airstrip was 350 feet long. Still short, still rough, still a gamble. But they kept going. Ellesmer sent updates via radio. The glider is ready. Crew selected. Weather window closing fast. You have days. The pressure surged. Men worked until they collapsed. Rested an hour. Worked again. Everyone knew the truth. If they missed the window, the monsoon rains would trap them here until fall. The Danny sensed it too. They stopped smiling. Started pushing harder. Even the children carried rocks. Warriors dug stumps. June 10th, nearly a month since the crash. At long last, 500 feet cleared. The airstrip wasn't perfect. It sloped slightly. It was only 30 feet wide. But it was flat. It was long enough. It was ready. Herndon radioed Hollandia. Landing zone complete. Ready for glider. The reply came quickly. Extraction tomorrow. Be ready. June 11th, 1945. Dawn rose over Shangri-La Valley in streaks of pink and gold. Cloud cover hung low on the peaks, but the wind was calm. Perfect conditions. The rescue team assembled at the edge of the strip. 2 15-foot poles had been buried deep in the dirt, 300 feet apart, with a nylon tow line stretched tight between them, the mechanism for the snatch. They reviewed the procedure again. Margaret would be strapped into a harness, lying flat on her back inside the glider. A rope would extend from the cockpit to the tow line. The C-47 would fly low, 20 feet off the ground. Hook the rope, and in less than 2 seconds, the glider would be yanked into the air, accelerating from 0 to 80 miles per hour almost instantly. There would be no second attempt, no margin for error, no other way out. Herndon gave Margaret one last injection of morphine. She smiled weakly, trying to be brave. The glider was on its way. This had never been done before. Not in combat. Not in mountains. Not with a human being at the end of the line. The United States Army had tested the glider snatch system in Ohio using sandbags, crates, and dummies. A few brave volunteers had tried it under controlled conditions. But no one had attempted it in a jungle valley surrounded by 14,000-foot peaks, with a wounded woman strapped to a harness, bleeding and half-broken from a crash. This would be the first time in history, and if it failed, Margaret Hastings would die. Neck snapped from acceleration, dragged through the trees, dropped from 500 feet when the line snapped. The weight of that risk fell hardest on the men chosen to fly it. Captain William Samuels, 26, Michigan, the glider pilot, combat veteran, had flown into fire, landed in smoke, survived Europe, survived the Pacific. But this felt different. He would have to land a powerless wooden aircraft on a 500-foot dirt strip carved by machete, in a jungle clearing surrounded by trees, then be yanked into the air again by a hook slung beneath a passing C-47. A technique barely tested. Never used for live extractions. He wrote letters to his parents the night before. So did his co-pilot. So did the C-47 crew. They understood exactly what this was. A suicide mission with a hope of survival. The plan was simple on paper. Extract Margaret Hastings first. Then Lieutenant McCullum. Then Sergeant Decker. 3 separate passes. 3 chances to fail. After that, the medics and engineers would be evacuated 2 at a time over multiple days. Some of the paratroopers chose to stay behind and walk out on foot, 150 miles through jungle and mountains to the coast. A 6-week trek through territory still roamed by Japanese stragglers. They preferred that to being hooked to a nylon cord and yanked into the sky. Herndon didn't blame them. He wasn't ordering anyone into the glider. Not for this. 0900 hours. June 11, 1945. The C-47 roared into view above Shangri-La Valley, dragging the glider behind it like a ghost on a tether. Captain Samuels was at the controls. At 5,000 feet, he detached from the tow line and began a steep spiral descent. No engine. No second attempt. No power to go around. If he missed the strip, if he misjudged the wind, the glider would crash into jungle and burn. The approach was brutal. Turbulence bounced the frame like a toy. The glider lined up. Dirt rushed toward them. Trees crowded the edges. Too fast. Too steep. Samuels flared. The glider bounced, skidded, touched down again, and stopped with 50 feet of runway left. Perfect landing. The soldiers erupted into cheers. Someone shouted, "Holy hell! He made it!" They rushed the aircraft. Checked for damage. None. Captain Samuels climbed out, looked at the strip, looked at the mountains, shook his head. He had landed. Now he had to take off by hook. The first test subject was Margaret Hastings. They carried her carefully on a stretcher. She was conscious, barely, her legs still raw with burns, fever still licking the edges of her awareness. Herndon knelt beside her, strapping her into the reinforced harness. "It's going to feel like you've been hit by a truck," he said gently. "But you'll survive, and then you'll be going home." Margaret tried to smile. "Just don't drop me." She was positioned in the glider body flat, harness secured, connected to the nylon tow line stretched between 2 buried poles. 300 feet of hope. The C-47 circled back. Low. Fast. 80 miles per hour. The rescue crew inside was silent. Eyes locked on the hook beneath the fuselage. One chance. No corrections. The hook struck true. A snap, a crack like a whip, the tow line went taut. Inside the glider, Margaret was yanked forward, acceleration slamming her back into the seat. 0 to 80 miles per hour in 2 seconds. The aircraft lifted, pulled from the ground like a leaf in a windstorm. She was airborne. Below, jungle trees flashed by. She felt weightless and crushed at the same time. Her burned legs screamed. The harness bit into her chest. But she was flying, alive. Inside the C-47, the winch operator got to work. Hand over hand, he pulled the line in. Slowly, steadily, Margaret rose toward the cargo hatch. The jungle roared beneath her. Wind tore at her hair. Then hands. Reaching. She was inside. The crew yanked her aboard. She collapsed in their arms, crying, laughing, gasping. She had made it. The first human being ever extracted by glider snatch in combat. History didn't matter to her. She just wanted to go home. Round 2. The C-47 dropped a fresh tow line. Crew on the ground reset the poles. Reattached the cord. Made ready. Lieutenant John McCullum stepped forward. He had watched Margaret's launch. Watched the speed. Watched the violence. Now it was his turn. He strapped in, face calm, but his knuckles white. The C-47 returned. Hook, snap, whiplash, lift. McCullum vanished into the sky, trailing behind the plane like a kite on a string. He couldn't breathe at first. The acceleration stole his lungs. But then came the winch, the rope, the crew's hands. Safe. Second survivor out. Round 3. Sergeant Kenneth Decker was last. His arm was still in a splint. The harness rubbed wrong. His face burned. But he nodded when they asked if he was ready. The C-47 came again. The hook snagged the line. Decker was airborne. A final prayer mouthed between clenched teeth. 10 minutes later, he was inside the aircraft. 3 survivors. 3 impossible extractions. The men who had crashed into a forgotten valley 30 days ago were now flying back to Hollandia. Alive. The mission wasn't over. Now came the harder part. Extracting the rescue team. Over the next 3 days, the glider returned again and again. Each time, the same violent snatch. The same single-chance landing. The same thunderous launch into sky. 2 men per trip. Each landing felt like threading a needle blindfolded. Each takeoff was a gamble with death. But somehow, someway, it worked. By the end of the week, every man who wanted out had been pulled from the jungle by hook and harness. Those who stayed behind, Herndon and a few volunteers, hiked out the long way. 47 days in the valley. Then 6 weeks on foot. They all made it. What began as a sightseeing trip had become one of the most daring rescue operations of World War II. An experiment turned into salvation. Each takeoff was terrifying. The glider sat still on a strip of dirt no longer than a football field. No engines. No second chances. The C-47 would descend, line up, extend its hook, and rip the glider into the air with passengers strapped inside, accelerating from 0 to flight speed in seconds. 9 times, Captain William Samuels landed in Shangri-La. 9 times, he took off again by snatch. 18 times, he stared down death and beat it. Not one accident. Not one injury. Every single man made it out alive. By June 14, 1945, 16 men had been extracted from the valley by glider snatch. The remaining soldiers, volunteers all, chose to walk out. Hiked for weeks through the jungle, across mountain passes, down toward the coast. Every one of them survived. The Dani people watched all of it. They had never seen aircraft before this month, and now flying machines were landing in their valley, snatching people into the sky. It was beyond imagining. When the last glider left, many of the Dani cried. Friendships had formed. Bonds built through weeks of work, through shared food, shared shelter, shared humanity. Before departing, the Americans left behind gifts. Machetes, metal tools, cloth, thread, supplies that would be treasured by the tribe for generations. They had helped save American lives. They had done it without being asked. They had asked for nothing in return. History would forget them, but the people who were there never would. Margaret Hastings. She spent months in army hospitals. Skin grafts, bandages, infections, pain. The burns on her legs healed slowly, left permanent scars. Reporters called her the WAC of Shangri-La. She appeared in newspapers, magazines. a young woman who had survived a plane crash, jungle wounds, infection, and been yanked into the sky by a tow rope. She didn't think of herself as a hero. When people asked, she always said the same thing. I was just lucky. Margaret was discharged in 1946. Married, had children, lived quietly, rarely spoke of Shangri-La. The memories were too surreal, too painful. She passed away in 1971. She was 50 years old. Lieutenant John McCullum. He never recovered from losing his twin brother, Robert. They had boarded the same plane. One lived. One burned in the wreckage. Survivor's guilt haunted McCullum for decades. He stayed in the military, rose through the ranks, eventually retired in California. He attended reunions, kept in touch with the men from the valley. But there was always a shadow behind his eyes. He never forgot that he walked away, and his brother didn't. He died in 2008, at age 89. Still carrying the weight of Shangri-La, Sergeant Kenneth Decker. He recovered, quietly, without fanfare. He finished his tour, returned home, started over. Rarely spoke about the crash, the jungle, the glider. When asked, he always pointed to others. The medics who jumped in. The pilot who pulled them out. The Danny people who made survival possible. He never claimed heroism. After his death in the 1990s, his family found the clippings. The medals. The citations. Stories he'd kept in a drawer but never shared. Lieutenant Walter H. Herndon. He became a legend in the 1st Recon Battalion. The medic who jumped into a Stone Age valley to save strangers. He was awarded multiple commendations. But every time someone tried to give him credit, he deflected. He spoke instead of. Bulletto, his fellow medic. The engineers who hacked an airstrip out of jungle. Samuels, who flew the glider. The Danny who made survival possible. He served again in Korea, rose to colonel, and spent his final years training the next generation of Army medics. He died in 1997, remembered by thousands of soldiers he had mentored. Captain William Samuels. 9 round trips, 18 landings and takeoffs. Not a scratch. Nothing else in his military career or in all of World War II could compare to Shangri-La. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. When reporters asked how he did it, he shrugged. I was just doing my job. But everyone knew the truth. Most pilots would have refused the mission. Samuels volunteered. He went on to become a commercial airline captain. Flew for 30 years. Retired. Died in 2003. At his funeral, Margaret Hastings' daughter read a eulogy. She said her mother never forgot the man who pulled her out of the jungle. Aftermath. The glider snatch technique was used a few more times in peacetime, but never again in combat. Too risky, too complex, too unforgiving. Operation Shangri-La was a one-time miracle. A rescue that should have failed. Plan that sounded insane. A jungle valley that became the stage for one of the greatest extractions in military history. Everything had to go right. The wind, the weather, the rope, the hook, the pilot, the courage. And it did. Because exceptional people did exceptional things under impossible circumstances. The story faded from public memory. No Hollywood movie. No textbooks. Just a footnote in a war full of chaos. The airstrip vanished. The jungle reclaimed the path. The Danny moved on. Time erased the evidence. But not the story. In 2011, a documentary crew visited the valley. They found Danny elders who remembered. Who told stories passed down from their grandparents. The flying machines. The woman with burned legs. The men who cut a long path through the jungle. The tools and fabric left behind. They still had some of it: cloth, steel, scissors. Proof that it had happened. They were proud of what their ancestors had done. They had helped save American lives. The real legacy of Shangri-La. This story is not about technology. It's not about tactics. Not even about the war. It's about people. Margaret Hastings, who refused to give up. John McCullum, who kept his friends alive through pain and grief. Walter Herndon, who jumped into darkness for strangers. William Samuels, who flew where no one else dared. The Danny people, who helped without asking for anything. The medics, the engineers, the paratroopers, all of them knew the risks. All of them could have said, "This isn't worth it." None of them did. They just did their jobs, pushed through fear, held the line between life and death. That's what made Shangri-La more than a valley. It became a symbol of what humans can endure, what they can achieve, when courage overrides doubt, and when the impossible becomes real. In the end, the story of Shangri-La wasn't about aircraft. It wasn't about the C-47 that shattered on a mountainside, or the glider that danced with death 9 times over a 500-foot jungle runway. It wasn't even about the mechanics of a rescue that military planners said could never be done. The real story was human refusal. Refusal to abandon the wounded. Refusal to let 3 people die because a map said there was no way in or out. Refusal to let impossible be the final answer. Against all logic, with hand tools, with Stone Age allies, with parachutes and machetes and rope, they carved a path into a valley untouched by time and pulled people back from the edge of death. And in doing so, they proved something greater than tactical ingenuity. They proved that impossible is just a word, that limits only exist until someone decides to push past them, that even in the most brutal war the world had ever known, there was room for hope, for determination, for cooperation across cultures separated by 10,000 years of history. This is the story of what happens when courage is louder than doubt, when strangers become brothers, when a jungle becomes a runway, and history is made, not with fanfare, but with sweat, tears, and quiet heroism. If this story moved you, we'd be honored if you'd like this video. Stories like these take days, sometimes weeks, of research to bring to light. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten heroes from the Second World War. More tales of courage, sacrifice, and the human spirit under fire. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story from the greatest generation. And we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? Your country, your city? Did you or someone in your family serve in World War II? Do you know of any stories like Shangri-La? Stories of survival, of rescue, of daring missions against the odds? Share your memories below. Let the legacy live on. For the survivors of Shangri-La, to Margaret Hastings, to John McCullum, to Kenneth Decker, to Walter H. Herndon, to William Samuels, to the Danny people who helped strangers when they didn't have to. You deserve more than a footnote in forgotten war records. You deserve to be remembered as the heroes you were. We're here to make sure that happens.